Hello, I'm Marlene Levitt. Welcome to PACE TV's The Pace of San Diego. Our show today is part of a series on gender identity, a very timely subject about something that is extremely misunderstood. Please welcome our guest, Evan Johnson, who uses the pronouns they, them, and theirs. Evan is the Community and Youth Programming Manager for Trans Family Support Services. They have fostered connection and understanding over the past 6 years by sharing their own journey as a non-binary youth, student, and young professional with many audiences, from national conferences to local organizations. Evan has a bachelor's degree in social work and helps train people in healthcare, legal, education, and other environments on gender diversity and policy. They are dedicated to educating, advocating, learning, and listening to create a safer world for all trans and gender nonconforming youth. Welcome to PACE TV.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here with y'all.
I know that there is much controversy today over the terminology that is used for the community of LGBTQIA. So I think we should first start out by enlightening our audience as to the terminology and to the letters. What do they mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's start with L.
Yeah, perfect. So first of all, when we're talking about this language, when we're talking about these definitions, it's important that we're really mindful that all of this language is fluid and flexible, right? Any person who holds these identities may define their experiences uniquely to their own identity, right? And that's okay. So we use working definitions in our trainings and in education to help give folks exposure to some of the language, but it's not the end all be all of the language and the definitions. So yeah, we'll start with L, lesbian. I think most folks are familiar with the term lesbian. We use it traditionally to refer to a feminine identified person, primarily attracted to other feminine identifying folks.
Okay. And then we get to G, like LGBTQIA. What is G?
So G is typically used for gay. Gay can be referred to in a handful of different ways in what its definition is. The main way that folks define gay is a person who is masculine identified, who's primarily attracted to other masculine identifying folks. But since our society is so familiar with this word gay, we do see a lot more of this flexibility, whereas any non-straight individual, so anyone who identifies as something other than heterosexual, may shorthand their sexual orientation as gay because that's easier to explain.
So lesbians are included in that?
They can be, yes. If they feel comfortable with both the word lesbian and gay, then yes, they can be included in both.
That's good, okay. Now we get to bisexual, which has a new word added to it, but we'll talk about that.
Yeah. So bisexuality is definitely the definition and the phrase that we've seen change a lot as we've gone through this process of opening up conversations to gender identity and inclusion, right? So the traditional definition of bisexual is definitely more that attraction to men and women. But as we expand our ideas of what gender is, bi just means two. And so some bisexual individuals may define their attraction as experiencing attraction to those of the same and differing gender identities. Some bi folks may still use that male-female definition. It's purely up to personal decisions.
Okay, and what is the other term that's used there?
Yeah, so sometimes we also will hear this term pansexual, which, and then if we look at those root letters, right, so bi meaning two, pan then means all. And so traditionally we use pansexuality to define an individual who experiences attraction to those of all gender identities. The definitions, well, all, pan is part of the all. So there is definitely, there's another word for attraction to many but not all gender identities. That's polysexual.
Okay.
So there's lots of language in there. And the definition for those three terms, bi, pan, and poly, they overlap a lot. But what's important is when we're having these conversations is that when someone tells us that they identify with one of these words over one of the other words, we reflect that back to them. So there's clearly a reason that they've chosen to identify as bisexual rather than pansexual or polysexual. And it's none of my business what that reason is. So I'm just going to reflect back that language
to them as if
absolutely.
You understand it and you're okay with it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly.
And now we get to the T, LGBT, transsexual. Transgender, rather.
Yeah, absolutely. So both T's are definitely used. Some folks will use transgender, some folks will use transsexual. It's complicated with those two terms. So transgender refers to any person whose gender identity is different than their sex assigned at birth. So we talk about sex assigned at birth in that sense of this is what the doctor has put on your birth certificate. Right? So we know that sex assigned at birth is not always in alignment with a person's anatomy and biological identity,
Right.
but for a very long time, we only had the two options. So any trans person is someone who identifies as something different than what was written on that birth certificate. Now, this has to do with gender identity. It has nothing to do with a person's sexual orientation or their attraction to others.
Right.
So trans.
But when you're saying transsexual.
Right. So transsexual is a little bit more complicated. It was the term was largely created by the medical and psychological communities, and they used this word transsexual to describe the difference between a person who said they were transgender versus someone who had obtained some form of what was thought of as permanent medical transition. There were a couple of issues with creating this distinction, the large one being that for many of us within the transgender community, even if we want to access medical transition, it can be incredibly difficult, expensive, or inaccessible to us. And so when we were advertising services to the transsexual community, we were unintentionally barring this entire part of our community from finding itself and finding its family, essentially. And so as a greater community within the trans population, we've decided that the word transgender is more appropriate to use as the umbrella term, whereas transsexual may be a term that a person uses individually, but we wouldn't want to impose that identity on someone who doesn't explicitly tell us that that's who they are.
I see. Okay. And then this is Q, queer or questioning. Queer has always been thought of as derogatory term.
Yeah.
And this is just lately in my lifetime that it's used for an umbrella term, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's this really interesting evolution that we see with the word queer in particular. And my parents were also very uncomfortable when I started identifying with queer because of that history. But it's really important that we're mindful, and this becomes kind of this overlapping piece of all of the language that we use, but language is as alive as the people who speak it. So as long as people are using the word queer, that definition is subject to change. It definitely has a history of being used negatively against our community, but what we've seen is many young LGBTQ individuals, in particular college age and younger, have been taking this word queer and have been turning it into a word of solidarity and empowerment. So queer simply becomes a shorthand for all of these long letters. So LGBTQIAAPD+, however you want to cut it, right? Queer is the way that our community recognizes our own experiences.
Now we get to intersex, which is very different.
Yeah. So the intersex community is a community of individuals who experience natural variance in their sex characteristics. So this is a biological identity. There's a lot of things that can happen to make a body intersex. We see, some individuals who have external genitalia that doesn't match their internal sex organs, right? Some folks who don't have internal sex organs. Some folks who may have one ovary, one testy. This is all part of the intersex community, as well as many other things. What's important to know is that the intersex community is actually a lot more common than we've been conditioned to believe. The rate of intersex births is about 4.6%, which is similar to the rate of twin births.
Yeah.
But we don't talk about the intersex community because for a very long time, what happened is when a child was born visibly intersex, doctors would say to parents, your child has a birth defect, and take those children into operation to make them look biologically female. So then child is returned to parents who are told, we fixed the problem, right? They're not told what the problem was. And then child goes through puberty, but maybe they are one of those intersex individuals who now their external genitalia may match a person who is female, but they don't have ovaries, right? Maybe they have testes, or again, one testy, one ovary. And so their puberty looks different. And our society doesn't love that. So the intersex community for many, many decades has been forced to conform to these biological definitions of male and female when that's not what their bodies want to do.
Now let's get to you. You were born, you grew up in Poway.
Mm-hmm.
You went to the Poway school system. Tell us a little bit about your family background.
Yeah. So my family, moved to California a couple years before my sister and I were born. My mom grew up in Ohio, West Virginia area, and my dad grew up in the DC area. And so huge culture shock coming out here to the West Coast, but it was good. They like it apparently because they're still here. And then they had my sister and I, we're twins. And it just kind of went from there. It was always really destigmatized in my family to be LGB, right? To identify as something other than straight. We had other family members, and my parents had a lot of really good friends from high school who were gay or bi. And so that was something that I knew was always going to be okay.
So, when did you take us back to your first earliest memory of when you began to feel that there was something that wasn't feeling right?
Yeah, it's it's tricky to put a finger on, right? Because it's like I've always felt the way that I feel. I think what's easiest to identify in my memory is there was a time in second grade where the way that I was dressing and the fact that, 7-year-olds really have no secondary sex characteristics, right? Where my peers didn't know if I was a boy or a girl. And that was something that was really exciting for me. And I can remember, especially from the back, because they knew my face. And so they knew, what language had been used in reference to me before, right? From the back, though, where I would get mistaken as both male and female classmates. And so that was something that was really exciting for me. That
Rather than being bullied about it.
Right. Well, so I don't think any of my peers really recognized it because, again, we're 7 years old.
Right.
Right. There's no real understanding of gender at that age, but I had the feeling, I knew in my heart that that felt best when people didn't know if I was a boy or a girl.
It's very interesting. I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting way. So, I don't know if you want to speak to this, but as you approached puberty, who were you attracted to?
So, my sexual orientation was always kind of a background thought for me. I never really had crushes growing up, and so I just never really had any thoughts or concerns about my orientation. My sister came out when we were 13 as gay, as lesbian. She uses both interchangeably.
This is your twin sister.
Yes, I only have the one.
Oh, okay.
So she came out when we were 13, and so I was like, oh, sure, we can start talking about this now. And so I found the word asexual, and that felt pretty authentic to my experiences at the time.
Okay, so then you eventually began to identify as transgender and non-binary. Can you tell us exactly what that means? Because gender is a broad term that includes a person's internal sense of who they are. That's called gender identity, right?
Right.
So what is transgender?
Right. So if gender identity, like you said, is this internal sense of knowing who I am, research has shown us that it forms around the ages of 3 to 5, and it's based in our brains, right? We all have a gender identity. And then the trans community, again, we look at like those Greek, Latin prefixes. Trans means across. And so to cross genders, right? So a trans person is any person whose gender identity is different than their sex assigned at birth. We also have language for individuals who are not transgender, right? And so we talk about the cisgender community, CIS, and that comes from the Latin meaning the same.
I was assigned at birth as a female, and I have identified all my life as a female. And that's cisgender?
Yeah, so you would be a cisgender woman.
Right.
Or a cisgender female if that's what feels more authentic to you. So then within the trans umbrella, non-binary describes any gender identity which is not explicitly male or female. So again, a lot of those cultural gender identities that we talked about earlier, like the Mahu, a Mahu person isn't necessarily a man or a woman. They fall in a completely unique third gender category. The Hijra of India, this is a legally recognized third gender in India. And then within the non-binary community in the US, we hear language like agender, gender fluid, gender flex, lots of language.
Right. And one of the things that I'm having a problem with, and I'm sure some other people are the pronouns.
Yeah.
You use the pronouns they, them, and theirs.
Yes.
And why are different pronouns used? Because that to me sounds plural.
Right, right.
Tell me about that.
So pronouns are, just like, to go back to elementary school for a second, pronouns are the third person language we use to refer to ourselves, right? So it's important that we have language that reflects the way that a person self-identifies. And so in the English language, we do have gendered pronouns, which not every language has, but we do. And so we have the he, him pronouns that are traditionally thought of as masculine pronouns, the she, her, which are traditionally thought of as feminine pronouns. And we do have the singular they, them, theirs. And a lot of us get stuck on this one because we think that they, them is explicitly a plural pronoun. But when we actually look back at our history of the English language and how it's been used over time, we see that we've used the singular they, them since the 1300s. And we use it subconsciously all the time, like they left the package at the door, who left their water bottle on the table. I don't know who these people are, but I'm going to use the singular they because that's what I know to do. It's that piece of when we see a person standing in front of us, our brains want to go on autopilot. Our brains want to make assumptions about how a person identifies and use those he, him, or she, her pronouns, but those are not always authentic to a person's experience.
Okay, so now how difficult was it for you during those early years, the teen years, when you were confused about your gender identity?
It was definitely a journey. It was, gosh, it was probably like 2012, 2013. And so we really weren't talking about the trans community at the time. I just knew I was distinctly uncomfortable with my assigned sex at birth.
When was this? And how old were you?
I was a high school freshman, so like 14, 15.
Okay. That's a certain time.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I was very uncomfortable with my assigned sex at birth. I also had some health issues related to my assigned sex at birth, which leads myself and some of the professionals in my life to think that I'm actually intersex, which is a whole thing, right? But I knew very early on that I was distinctly uncomfortable with being perceived as female. I was assigned female at birth.
Were you dressing as a female in school?
I was trying. I was trying to. I wasn't really comfortable in feminine clothing. I was more comfortable in ambiguous clothing because I didn't want people to know. So I wore a lot of baggy shirts and baggy pants. And we joke a lot in the trans community that we all have what's called a dysphoria hoodie, which gender dysphoria is the distress that trans people experience based on how society perceives them versus who they know themselves to be.
So it's a hoodie.
So it's a really big hoodie. It's this massive hoodie. So I dressed very much like that. And, I definitely, my friends always tried to get me to wear makeup, and I had super long hair, but I never really took care of it. And it very much was this awkward time for me.
So I understand that people during that time have a lot of suicidal thoughts and eating disorders, emotional distress. Tell me about the trans youth's attempt to end their lives.
Yeah. So, and this is partially contributed to by gender dysphoria, right? So being really mindful that this has nothing to do with, like, we don't say that people were born in the wrong body, right? No one was born in the wrong body. The distress piece, these higher rates of suicidal ideation, of anxiety, of self-harming behaviors, that's coming from externally, right? Social pushback, what they're hearing from their peers. So yes, we absolutely see elevated rates of depression, anxiety. We also see elevated rates of eating disorders in the trans community. And this kind of has a dual reason within our community. It may be because of body dysphoria. It may be because of a distress of how a person looks. So like for myself, as someone assigned female at birth, I knew if I didn't eat, I wouldn't get my menstrual cycle. And so I starved myself so I wouldn't have a period because that was something that was incredibly distressing for me. And then we also see this layer where many folks within our community will restrict food and drink intake so that they can avoid public restrooms, right? And so with that, we also see elevated rates of UTIs, bladder and kidney infections in the trans population. The California CDE Healthy Kids Survey, they put out a statistic that of trans youth in the state of California, so that's just here in California, 52% will consider suicide compared to just 16% of their cisgender peers. And so this number is really significant because when we're looking at it, I mean, ultimately, the state of California is really protective of our trans and non-binary students from a legislative side.
Right.
What's unfortunate, though, is the social support isn't always there. And so we really see this piece of, and this is a big part of our work, where we want to come into spaces. It truly is a part of our mission that we believe every trans and non-binary youth should have at least one family member who is affirming of their identity. Because having one adult in your life that is affirming of your identity, research has shown, the Trevor Project specifically put out, that having that one affirming adult will reduce a youth suicide attempt rate by 40%.
That's huge.
It's a big number.
That's a big number.
Yeah.
So you attended Poway High School.
I did.
And tell us what group you were president of.
I was the president and the founder of the Poway High GSA.
Which is?
So it's thought of in a couple of different ways. We used GSA to define Gender Sexuality Alliance. Some people say Gay Straight Alliance. Lots of different names exist for these, but essentially LGBTQ student-led clubs.
Is that when you came out to your parents, when you were the president there?
No. I came out to my parents initially my sophomore year of high school, but it didn't go so well. So I actually went back in the closet at home.
Had your sister come out at that point?
Yes, but my sister had come out with a sexual orientation different than straight. It was okay for me to be queer in the non-straight sense. It wasn't okay for me to be non-binary. It was my gender identity that my parents really struggled with. So I was able to be out as an LGB person. I was able to be out as a queer woman, right? But I couldn't be out as trans with my parents. So I didn't come out to my parents till I was 21.
Wow. But then later you graduated from San Diego State.
Yes.
With a bachelor's in social work.
I sure did.
And what did you want to do in social work?
Well, I always knew I was going to be doing this with my degree. I've been with the organization for 6 years, and when I started, so that was right when I graduated high school, and when I started with the org, I was actually initially an archaeology student. So I really wanted to go into history, and I wanted to be a museum curator, but I fell in love with this work. So social work, thank you. Social work was a degree that would allow me to serve this population and community, and so now I'm doing this, and I would love to do medical advocacy in the future.
And now you've been working as the community and youth programming manager at
Trans Family Support Services.
It's a nonprofit organization, and what does that do?
So we're a nonprofit that was founded and created right here in Poway. Like my executive director and our founder lives in the Poway Unified District, and so the work really started here in North County, but we are now an international organization, which is wild. We have our chapter here in San Diego, we have a chapter out in Huntsville, Alabama, and we have clients all across the world. We do anything. We do anything to help folks get to that place of gender affirmation and support. So we do youth support, parent support, we do medical and legal navigation, and then the other big piece, the other big arm of what we do is education. So these sorts of conversations where, we share with folks what these words mean and what this community is experiencing to get folks to a place where they have some of the tools to start being affirming.
And for that work, you received, and this is how I knew about you, because I saw a newspaper article about you, you received the Leon L. Williams Human Relations Commission Youth Award given out by the County of San Diego. Congratulations on that. That's an honor.
Thank you. It's this incredible painting that they gave us instead of like a silly little plaque, which is pretty cool. But the other thing that I would say is, and I think this is the most important part, is as folks are starting to explore whatever, gender identity, sexual orientation, it's so important that you follow your joy, right? I think a lot of times we focus on the distress that trans people are experiencing, those higher rates of suicidality, those higher rates of dysphoria, But it's more important that we recognize that being trans can be an incredibly joyful experience. Thinking back, like when I was in second grade and I got mistaken as both a boy and a girl all the time, and how good that felt. So I really encourage folks, as they're questioning, as they're exploring, to just follow the things that make them happy. If that's a certain haircut, if that's people calling you with certain pronouns, whatever it is, lean into that.
And to reach you, you can the folks can reach Evan directly at evan@transfamilysos.org. And I'll list the phone number there. And also your place of work is Trans Family Support Services, and their website is transfamilysos.org. And I want to thank you so much.
Of course. Thanks
Evan,
for having
being
me.
here. It's a pleasure, and I've been very enlightened, and I hope the audience has too. And for further episodes of our series on gender identity, along with other PACE TV shows, please go to our website, pace-tv.com, and click on schedules for our monthly showtimes. We welcome your suggestions and comments. Please email us at www.info@pace-tv.com. Thank you all for watching The Pace of San Diego.
If you'd like to find out more
about joining our group here at PACE TV,
please go to our website,
www.pace-tv.com.
It's never too late to have fun.
Learning a new skill.
Thanks for tuning in.